In the lively town of Amati, Pastor Adana's name was known in every home. Her voice was powerful, and her sermons were captivating. Pastor Adana seemed like a kind-hearted woman who cared about her church and its people. Her church had grown quickly, and every Sunday, crowds packed the pews, eager to see the miracles she promised. People whispered that she could do the impossible: make the sick healthy, let the blind see, and help the crippled walk again. People left their villages early in the morning, carrying their sick relatives, hoping for a miracle. Pastor Adana would stand on the stage, lifting her arms high and calling out to the crowd. "Today, the Lord will bring healing and miracles among us," she proclaimed. People cheered, waving their hands, while others shed tears of joy, already believing in her words. Adana would call out, "Who is here that needs a miracle? Come forward and feel the healing power." Each week, two familiar faces were among those who came forward. Chaik, a well-known beggar, was one of these sick people. He would shuffle forward, acting as if he were blind, waving his arms and asking for help. Pastor Adana would place her hand on his head, saying, "Open your eyes to the light." Chaik would blink, squint, and suddenly shout, "I can see! I can see!" The crowd roared with excitement. People threw money, danced, and sang. Next, Ngozi would limp toward Pastor Adana, appearing frail and weak. After a brief prayer, she would suddenly stand tall and begin to dance with joy, as if she had been healed. To the crowd, these were miracles. But few knew that Chaik and Ngozi were part of Pastor Adana's plan. They were paid small sums each week to act blind and crippled, only to be healed before the crowd. Pastor Adana's church was making a lot of money, and the people believed every word she said. But deep inside, Pastor Adana knew her actions were wrong, and a small voice kept warning her. Late at night, when everyone in Amati was asleep, Pastor Adana would slip out of her house quietly. She walked with purpose, making her way through the quiet streets toward a hidden river just outside town. This was not an ordinary river. It was known to be mysterious and was rarely visited by the townspeople who thought it was haunted. But Pastor Adana was drawn to it for a different reason. She believed that a powerful, dark spirit lived in the water, a spirit that could give her power and make her famous. Pastor Adana knelt by the river's edge, whispering strange words. "Great Spirit, I offer my thanks. Bring me more people and fill my church. Give me strength to keep them coming and to make them believe." She made promises to this spirit, swearing that she would continue to trick people as long as she grew wealthier and more powerful. The water seemed to shimmer as if it were alive, and Pastor Adana believed that her requests had been accepted. The following morning, her church was fuller than ever. People had heard of the miracles, and some said they felt drawn to the church as if by magic. Pastor Adana believed this was the work of the Spirit, making her church a place everyone wanted to visit. In secret, she was proud of her growing influence and wealth. Yet the people had no idea that Pastor Adana was not only deceiving them with fake miracles, but was also relying on a dark spirit to gain power. Pastor Adana's fame grew, and soon powerful men, politicians and businessmen from the city, began visiting her. They admired her influence and saw her church as a perfect place to hide their money. These men trusted Pastor Adana to keep their secrets, and she accepted large sums of money to hide in her church's bank accounts. The townspeople thought their pastor was humble and holy, but she was hiding a mountain of secrets beneath her gentle smile. Inspector Obina had heard stories about the miracles happening at Pastor Adana's church. He'd seen the town transform from skeptical to mesmerized by the tales of healing and deliverance. People spoke in awe of how a blind man could suddenly see, or how a woman crippled for years could dance with joy. At first, he thought it was just town gossip. But the stories grew more sensational with each passing week, and people's excitement spread like wildfire. Soon, even those who didn't attend her church started talking about it. One day, as Obinna sipped tea in a local cafe, he overheard two women whispering. They talked about how Pastor Adana had healed Chaik the blind man 3 times. "Isn't it strange that the same man keeps coming back blind?" one woman said, suspiciously. "Maybe he goes blind again," her friend replied, although her tone was uncertain. Obinna raised his eyebrows. The same man healed multiple times? That didn't add up. From years of working as a detective, Obinna knew when something felt off. He decided he would look into it further. After all, he owed it to the people of Amadi to ensure their trust wasn't misplaced. The next Sunday, Obinna attended Pastor Adana's church for the first time, slipping quietly into a back row. The air buzzed with excitement as people filled the room, dressed in their finest clothes and clutching small envelopes with money for offerings. Everyone was eager to witness Pastor Adana's miracles. When Pastor Adana took the stage, she was full of energy, her voice booming across the hall. She wore an elaborate gown that sparkled under the lights, making her look almost magical. Her voice rang out, "Who among you has come for healing today?" Almost on cue, Chaik, the familiar blind man, stumbled forward. Obinna watched closely as Pastor Adana called him to the stage, placing her hands on his head with a dramatic flourish. "Lord, heal this man," she cried. She stepped back, and Chaik opened his eyes wide, shouting, "I can see! I can see!" The crowd erupted in cheers, people clapping and dancing, some even wiping tears of joy. But Obinna's eyes narrowed. He noticed how Chaik and Pastor Adana exchanged a brief, almost invisible nod. It was a small signal, but enough to confirm his suspicions. As the weeks went by, Obinna returned each Sunday, carefully observing Pastor Adana's performances. He noticed how Chaik and Ngozi were always the ones healed, but their ailments seemed to return week after week. It became clear that something was terribly wrong. He also saw men in fine suits slipping into the back rooms after the service, carrying briefcases they never opened. Obinna knew the signs of money laundering and shady deals. He'd seen them plenty of times in his career. Obinna decided it was time to gather solid evidence. He planned to confront Pastor Adana, but he knew he had to be cautious. She was powerful and had influential friends. He began discreetly questioning people in the town, piecing together information about her meetings with wealthy politicians and business owners. Each clue strengthened his resolve. Amadi's beloved pastor was not who she seemed. With enough evidence collected, Obinna crafted a plan. He decided to gather a few police officers and a trusted doctor, instructing them to dress like ordinary worshippers. Together, they would attend Pastor Adana's Sunday service, waiting for the moment to expose her. Obinna felt the weight of his decision. He knew he was up against someone with a lot of power and influence, but he also knew that the people deserved to know the truth. On the day of the service, Obinna positioned his team strategically in the church. He made sure the doctor sat near the front, so he could intervene if Pastor Adana attempted another healing. The atmosphere in the church was electric, the crowd singing praises, clapping their hands, and dancing as Pastor Adana stepped onto the stage. She smiled and waved, her presence commanding respect and admiration from everyone. Today, Obinna noticed something different in Pastor Adana's demeanor. She looked even more confident, her eyes scanning the crowd with a glint of pride. She began her sermon, her words loud and passionate, calling on the power of the divine. Then, as always, she asked, "Who here needs a miracle today?" Ngozi limped forward, playing her role perfectly. Her face looked pained, her movements slow and awkward, just as they rehearsed every week. The crowd hushed, waiting for the miracle. Pastor Adana laid her hands on Ngozi's head, whispering a prayer. Suddenly, Ngozi straightened up, throwing her crutches aside, dancing and twirling with newfound energy. The crowd went wild, shouting, clapping, and singing praises. Obinna caught the signal he was waiting for. He stepped forward, calling out, "Pastor Adana, wait." His voice cut through the noise, and everyone fell silent, turning to look at him. Pastor Adana looked stunned, her eyes widening. "Inspector Obinna," she said, forcing a laugh. "What a surprise. Do you need a miracle too?" Obinna shook his head, his face serious. "Before you heal anyone else, Pastor Adana, let us confirm this woman's condition with a doctor. I've brought one with me today." He gestured to the doctor, who stood up and walked toward the stage. Pastor Adana's smile faltered, and she looked around nervously. The crowd murmured in confusion, curious to see what would happen next. The atmosphere in the church turned tense as Inspector Obinna called for the doctor. The crowd watched in bewilderment, whispers echoing through the hall as the doctor approached the stage to examine Ngozi. Many congregants, who had previously been swept up in the fervor of Pastor Adana's supposed miracles, felt a wave of unease. Some looked on with curiosity, while others shook their heads, muttering that Inspector Obinna was making a grave mistake by questioning a woman of God. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stepped forward cautiously. He understood the sensitivity of the situation, knowing how revered Pastor Adana was by the community. "Please, ma'am," he said gently to Ngozi, "if you could let me examine you briefly. It won't take long." Ngozi hesitated, her eyes darting nervously to Pastor Adana, who stood rigid, a thin smile plastered on her face. Her gaze was intense, silently urging Ngozi to stay in character. But under Obinna's watchful eye, Ngozi had no choice but to comply. She extended her leg, her movement noticeably smooth and unrestricted. The doctor conducted a brief but thorough examination, asking Ngozi to bend her knee, twist her ankle, and walk back and forth across the stage. The congregation watched, riveted, as it became clear that Ngozi displayed no signs of disability. The doctor stepped back and addressed the crowd with a loud, calm voice. "This woman shows no signs of injury or disability. She can walk and move perfectly well. It appears there has been no miraculous healing here, just a performance." A collective gasp spread through the congregation as the truth sank in. People exchanged stunned glances, some covering their mouths in disbelief. For many, this revelation shattered the image they had held of Pastor Adana as a divine healer. Whispers rose, swirling around the church like an uneasy wind. Pastor Adana's face drained of color. She tried to regain her composure, raising her hands in a plea for calm. "Brothers and sisters," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "this is a misunderstanding. This is simply a test of faith. Yes, a demonstration to strengthen your belief in God's power." But the crowd was no longer swayed by her words. Obinna seized the moment, stepping forward with authority. He held up a small recording device, a tangible symbol of truth amid the deception. "I have recorded evidence of you, Pastor Adana," he announced. "For weeks, I've observed the same people being healed repeatedly, individuals you paid to act as though they were sick or injured." Murmurs turned into raised voices as the crowd voiced their disbelief and anger. "How could you deceive us?" shouted an elderly woman from the front row, tears streaming down her face. She had believed in Pastor Adana's powers with all her heart, giving her last savings to the church in hopes of a miracle. "You took advantage of our faith," yelled a young man, his voice thick with emotion. Others joined in, venting their betrayal and anger. Some people wept openly, feeling the weight of having placed their hopes in a false prophet. Pastor Adana's facade was crumbling, and the congregation's unwavering loyalty transformed into disillusionment and outrage. Desperate to salvage her reputation, Pastor Adana tried to appeal to the crowd's emotions. "I have always served this community with love and devotion," she insisted. "I only wanted to help strengthen your faith. Can't you see that my intentions were pure?" But the crowd was no longer willing to listen. People began standing up, shaking their heads, and walking toward the exit. Their expressions were hardened, their trust shattered. A woman with a baby on her hip shouted, "You took food out of our mouths. We gave everything we had because we believed in you." Obinna, seeing the tide of public opinion fully turned against her, continued, "This isn't all, Pastor Adana. We also have evidence that you've been working with politicians and wealthy individuals, using the church as a front to launder their dirty money. This place of worship has been a den of lies and deceit." The words struck like a thunderclap. People gasped, the enormity of the betrayal settling over them like a dark cloud. Some congregants began chanting, "Liar," "Fraud." Others simply shook their heads, their faces twisted with grief and disappointment. Pastor Adana's confidence evaporated, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. The people who had once looked up to her now regarded her with disdain and anger. Her carefully constructed empire of lies was falling apart, and there was no way to rebuild it. As the last of the congregation filed out, Pastor Adana was left standing alone on the stage. The once vibrant church hall was now cold and empty, echoing with the silence of broken trust. Obinna, his duty complete, left quietly, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions. The days that followed Pastor Adana's exposure were some of the darkest she had ever experienced. The once beloved pastor who had commanded admiration and respect in the town of Amati was now an outcast. News of her deception spread like wildfire, reaching neighboring towns and cities. Pastor Adana found herself isolated, with no one left to support or defend her. Politicians and businessmen who had once used her church as a front for their illicit dealings quickly distanced themselves, eager to avoid being associated with her downfall. Those who had once been her allies now ignored her, refusing her calls and avoiding her in public. Pastor Adana's world had collapsed, and she felt a deep, aching void where power and adoration had once filled her heart. One evening, overwhelmed by the weight of her loneliness, Pastor Adana found herself by the river. This was the place where she had once believed she could harness spiritual power, where she had felt invincible. But now, standing alone by the water's edge, she felt only shame and regret. Her reflection in the water looked back at her, hollow and lifeless, a reminder of the person she had become, a person she could barely recognize. Days turned into weeks as Pastor Adana struggled to come to terms with her new reality. She was no longer welcomed in the town's social circles, and people avoided her on the street. Even children pointed and whispered, their innocent voices filled with the accusations that haunted her every waking moment. She knew that she had brought this upon herself, but the realization did little to ease her suffering. Finally, Pastor Adana made a decision. She would go door to door, seeking forgiveness from those she had wronged. It was a humbling and painful process. Each knock on a door was a reminder of the lives she had betrayed. She apologized to families who had sacrificed their savings, to widows who had given everything in the hopes of healing, and to children who had watched their parents' faith crumble. Some people accepted her apology with quiet nods, their faces filled with sadness. Others closed their doors in her face, unable to forgive the woman who had taken advantage of their faith. Each encounter left a deeper mark on Pastor Adana, chipping away at the remnants of her pride. In time, Pastor Adana found a new purpose. She began volunteering at local shelters, helping the needy without asking for anything in return. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, and caring for the people she had once looked down upon. Slowly, she rebuilt her life, not as a revered pastor, but as a humble servant. Through her acts of repentance, Pastor Adana learned a valuable lesson. She realized that true faith was not about grand displays of power or fame. It was about kindness, humility, and serving others without expecting anything in return. Her journey from power to humility became a cautionary tale in Amati, a reminder to all that lies and deception would ultimately lead to downfall. The story of Pastor Adana left a lasting impact on the town. People became more discerning, cautious of those who used religion for personal gain. Her story was retold countless times, a moral lesson that reminded everyone of the importance of genuine faith and the dangers of greed and deception. In the end, Pastor Adana's life changed, not because she was punished by others, but because she faced the consequences of her own actions. She was forced to look within and confront the person she had become, emerging from the darkness with a new understanding of what it meant to truly serve others.